crisis that has gripped Ukraine since the end of 2013 has brought mass street protests, the fall of an authoritarian government, thousands of civilian deaths, and the displacement of many thousands more from their homes in the east and south of the country. It has also brought relations between Russia and the West to their lowest point in decades, with the annexation of Crimea in March and in July the horrific downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, spurring the US and its allies to impose sanctions on Putin's Russia. Amid the commemorations of the First World War, opinion columnists and policymakers made anxious comparisons between Ukraine and the Balkans, two wild zones on the edge of Europe, capable of dragging the world into a disastrous conflict. Writing in the FT at the beginning of August, the paper's go-to historian Niall Ferguson asked if, as in 1914, a relatively small crisis over a chunk of third-rate Eastern European real estate could again produce a global conflict. For Roger Cohen, writing in the New York Times in March, two parallels sprang to mind: Sarajevo and the Sudetenland, Europe's ghosts hover. Events have moved quickly and unpredictably in Ukraine in these last months, and it's been no simple task to convey the reality on the ground. Western news media have followed these developments closely, running plenty of informative reportage as well as reams of commentary and editorial statements. It would be a mistake, though, to think that the West's major newspapers have been mere bystanders. On the contrary, the media have played a hugely important role in shaping perceptions of the conflict in Ukraine, ever since the initial protests broke out in November 2013, right through the fall of the Yanukovych government in February, the annexation of Crimea, and, since the spring, the conflict between the authorities in Kiev and separatist militias in the east. So what influence has Western coverage had? Put simply, the overall effect has been to downplay the West's own active role in the geopolitical struggle over Ukraine. Because all along, the central factor driving the crisis there has been that, tragically for the Ukrainians themselves, their country stands on a geopolitical fault line between Russia and the West. Everything that's been happening there is to some extent a reflection of or response to this fundamental strategic contest, in which both the West and Russia have actively participated, each making moves and counter-moves to pull Ukraine into their sphere of influence. But in the Western press, one half of this contest has, on the whole, been pushed into the background. The West's strategic grab for Ukraine vanishes from view, and so the aggressive Russian strategies for forcing Ukraine back into its own orbit seem to take place in a vacuum, the pure imperial appetites of the insatiable bear. Of course, the Western press have been far better than the Russian media. Kremlin-controlled outlets have spewed out distortions or outright falsehoods one after another, a crude propaganda operation that would have embarrassed even the worst party hacks of the Brezhnev era. The Western media are much more refined in their approach, subtly bending readers' views in certain directions by including some details and omitting others, by choosing one adjective rather than another. It's so subtle that they may not even notice themselves that they're doing it, and that's the hallmark of a truly successful indoctrination into the ruling ideology. To see how this works, let's look at how the Western mainstream media have framed key moments in the unfolding of the Ukrainian crisis. Perhaps the first thing to bear in mind is that the struggle for Ukraine didn't start in late 2013. Since the fall of communism, the West has been looking to pull the former Soviet states into its military structures and its economic sphere, hence the eastward advance of NATO, which now reaches right up to Russia's borders, and the expansion of the EU in NATO's wake. Ukraine was always the big prize for which NATO and the EU have been reaching for years, the EU dangling economic agreements, and NATO suggesting various kinds of partnership. 6 years ago, the Russian-Georgian War forced a temporary halt to these initiatives, as it became clear that Russia would push back against Western attempts to expand into its neighborhood. 2008 brought a return to Cold War rhetoric that many right-wing ideologues probably found comforting. That year, The Economist's former Russia correspondent rushed out a book titled The New Cold War, with the subtitle How the Kremlin Menaces Russia and the West. It wasn't long, though, before the EU was at it again, drawing up an association agreement with Ukraine that would break down tariff barriers and trade restrictions to open the country's markets for European capital. The agreement also envisaged deepening cooperation between Ukraine and the EU on security and defense, a way of quietly shuffling the country towards NATO membership. In any case, the deal was far from the minor detail many Western commentators later claimed it was, an infinite banality, a minnow, as Roger Cohen put it in the New York Times. Much of the Ukrainian elite was in favour, but according to reputable polls, in November 2013 the population itself was evenly divided, around 40% in favour, 40% against, 20% undecided. When pro-EU protests broke out in Kiev after President Yanukovych decided, under massive Russian pressure, not to sign the agreement, these divisions came out into the open, and with them the larger strategic battle between Russia and the West. Here the media tended to adopt a two-track strategy. On the one hand, columnists and leader writers generally acknowledged that the situation was complex and that Ukraine was divided in various ways – political, cultural, linguistic, religious – and that it had historical ties both to Russia and to its Western neighbours. The Guardian concluded, logically enough, that what Ukrainians seem to want is a strong connection with Europe and a strong and safe connection with Russia. There is no reason, other than stupidity or malice on the part of outsiders, why they should not have both. For other major outlets, on the other hand, Ukraine was facing a much more black-and-white choice. As the New York Times put it, Europe offered the way to a brighter economic future, whereas Russia offered only threats and bribes. In the same editorial, the Times unselfconsciously referred, on the one hand, to Russia having leverage to bully Ukraine into its geopolitical orbit, clearly a bad thing, and on the other hand, to the need for Europe and the US to offer Ukraine financial support to tie the country more closely to the West. Obviously not the same kind of thing at all. Russia was strong-arming, you see, whereas Europe was holding out values. So Ukraine was facing a choice, but it was pretty clear which way it was supposed to go, and sure enough, the Ukrainians had apparently already made the right decision. A New York Times editorial from February declared that Ukrainians believe their future is with the values and practices of the West. And in March, The Economist said that the protesters on the Maidan look westward to Europe, which offers their country its best hope of overcoming chronic corruption and bolstering the economy. The problem, as The Economist saw it, was that 46 million people are being held hostage in Ukraine. Kidnapped by the Kremlin, screamed the cover from the 8th of March. In January, The Guardian had worried about whether Ukrainians would be allowed to make a free choice about their own government and national direction without further internal disorder and without outside, which in practice largely means Russian, interference. There is no doubt, of course, that Russia has been interfering throughout the Ukrainian crisis, putting pressure on the country's politicians, almost certainly sending security service operatives into the east to foment separatist rebellion there, and most recently probably sending weapons too. But the idea that this has been the only kind of interference happening in Ukraine is something of a fiction, sustained by the ways in which Western media describe the actions of their own rulers as distinct from, say, Russia's. When Putin kept on supporting the Yanukovych government's brutal crackdown on demonstrators in Kiev in January and February, The Economist rushed to blame the entire unstable situation on him. The cover of its 22nd of February issue called it Putin's Inferno. By contrast, when one European dignitary or US politico after another was telling the Ukrainian elite what to do, the Western press acted as if they were just offering moral support, an altruistic helping hand. In December, The Guardian remarked that European and American envoys have rushed to Kiev in the hope of containing the crisis. And the New York Times applauded the fact that US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland handed out bread on the square in December. In February, the New York Times blandly let slip that in the past 2 weeks, Vice President Joseph Biden, Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany, and José Manuel Barroso, the President of the European Commission, have been in daily and rotating contact with Mr. Yanukovych. All this with the heartwarming aim, as US Secretary of State John Kerry put it, of standing with the people of Ukraine in the fight for a democratic European future. With the annexation of Crimea, the opinion makers went into overdrive, the New York Times describing Russia's forcible seizure of the peninsula after a suspect referendum as an outrageous and dangerous power play, a blatant transgression of international law. Which indeed it was, though it's strange how the same objections tend not to crop up when the US or its allies invade or occupy a country. Over the course of the spring, a series of pro-Russian protests in eastern Ukraine gradually morphed into an armed rebellion against the government in Kiev. Initially, the Western media were reluctant to give these protests anything like the same attention or coverage as they had the demonstrations on the Maidan. The Guardian referred to them as miniature uprisings, very small, quite possibly orchestrated by Russia, while the New York Times called it political theatre supported, if not directed, by the Kremlin. There can be little doubt that Russia encouraged them and more than likely provided some funds and weapons as the protesters turned into roving bands of militiamen. But there was still a core of local support to these mobilizations, as well as a suspicion of the new interim government and of Ukrainian nationalism more generally that the Western press was slow to recognize. It was only once reporters had spent more time on the ground in eastern Ukraine that the existence of some genuine pro-Russian sentiment filtered through, albeit described in the New York Times' dispatches as quixotic or even crackpot. The move to pathologize the pro-Russian militias has at times been matched by a symmetrical impulse to whitewash the Ukrainian nationalist forces. The FT, for example, in a report on the volunteer Azov battalion fighting on the pro-government side in eastern Ukraine, noted that it was founded by the Social National Assembly, which it described as a group that was heavily involved in the protests on Kiev's Maidan Square. The Social National Assembly is not just any group, however, but a far-right neo-Nazi organization, which espouses an ideology proclaiming the superiority of the white race. If there's a prize for misleading under-description, this must surely be a contender for this year's award. Putin bears much of the responsibility for the spiraling chaos in eastern Ukraine, quite possibly including the downing of the civilian airliner that killed 300 people in July. So it's understandable that much media attention has focused on his personality and character, his motivations and designs. But here again, the editorial slant of mainstream papers and magazines has tended to portray Putin's actions in isolation, as irrational outbursts of aggression by a tyrant lifted straight out of a storybook. Hence The Economist's Web of Lies cover from late July, or The Guardian's much earlier evocation of Putin's forked tongue. In reality, they are the aggressive moves of a regime that has steadily lost strategic ground and is responding by lashing out, flailing wildly in the attempt to halt the West's advance. These attempts have backfired disastrously. As The Guardian noted smugly at the end of March, when Putin seized Crimea, he lost Ukraine. The point here is not to exonerate the Russian president, nor to argue that any of Russia's actions have been excusable. But they should be explicable, and the media should have been helping us to understand what was at stake, who was really influencing the situation, and for whose benefit. Thanks to the mainstream media's coverage, Western publics have generally seen developments in Ukraine as the alarming product of Russian actions, rather than the cumulative outcome of geopolitical tensions. By blurring the West's part in the battle for Ukraine, the media has actually omitted half the story, the silent, victorious half.